Hello, friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast, bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. We're continuing our crash course series through the Bible, and we're wrapping up the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, as they say, by covering Deuteronomy. So, Jeremy, what does Deuteronomy mean?
Yeah, Deuteronomy. It's a mashup word in Latin, deutero, and nomi, and the two together means second law. So Deuteronomy is basically a restatement of the Ten Commandments back from Exodus. And now, if you remember the storyline of Numbers, well, go back to the storyline of Exodus. Israel comes out of Egypt. They wander in the desert for 40 years. One generation dies in the desert. The next generation is now going to inherit the promised land. And so Deuteronomy is like the sort of reminder and restatement to a new generation of what God requires of his people before they enter in the promised land. It's kind of like reminding the people of the sort of charter statement or the charter narrative for future generations.
I'm just coming to me right now. Like, it's kind of like the epistles in the New Testament. It's like we're recapping the gospel. Like, hey, the gospel happened, the generation ago. Now we got to remember what happened.
That's right.
These are some helpful pointers to keep what's essential there.
Right. Actually, as you say that too, it's kind of like Acts, because Acts is written to a generation later. It's like, hey, this is what the church was all about. Make sure that you stay the course.
And in this situation, you have Moses telling the generation after him, being like, all right, we're going to do a recap. These are essentials. Keep the commandments. So it'd be like a baby boomer telling a millennial, or like, hey, knock it out. Trust God. This is what's important.
Right.
Or millennials telling the next generation, not Generation Z or Z, and then the one after that, our children are Generation Alpha, I think is the primary. I kind of like that name, Generation Alpha, that are Alpha generation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now that we're talking about it, it really is. It's a dialogue between generations. It's a passing down of the torch, and Deuteronomy frames that whole conversation. It's also the end of, like you said, it's the end of the Pentateuch. So the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. It's also called the Torah. Torah in Hebrew means instruction. So usually we talk about Torah meaning like law, which it can kind of mean law, but instruction has sort of more to do with wisdom for living a life, and so the first 5 books of the Bible are inviting you into the wisdom of God's covenant with his people and how to live well in a world with God.
Yeah, and like the main theme here is pretty much like Moses saying, like, just worship God, trust God, obey God. Like, don't forget that. And I love all the people like I respect who are older than me, and like I always ask for advice. I'm like, hey, you have any pointers? And like usually the most spiritual person would be just like that simple phrase, just trust God, like obey God, be faithful, and that's it. Just do that.
Right. I guess, and I guess the Deuteronomy in specific, since it's summarizing the 10 Commandments or the Decalogue, however you want to say it. There's a famous way of reading the 10 Commandments where, the first half has to do with the vertical relationship between you and God, and then the second half has to do with your relationship with other people, horizontally. So, really, you could sum up Deuteronomy as a reminder to the people to be faithful to God by being faithful to one another. So it's fidelity to God and fidelity to your fellow neighbor.
Love God and love others.
Right.
Yeah, so like the 4 the vertical relationship commandments with God are like worship him alone, right? Don't make any idols. Keep the Sabbath holy and don't misuse God's name, right? And then the other side of the tablets is like respect your parents, honor them. Don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't murder anyone. Don't lie.
Yeah. And and that's generally the Hebrew the Hebrew vision of justice has to do with that second half of the 10 Commandments. and it's rooted in the first half. I think that's idolatry always ends up being about perpetuating social injustices in the Old Testament. So when people are unfaithful to God and forget who God is, they end up, you know, running after other nations and signing out false treaties and hurting the poor and perpetuating wars that just aren't good for their people. So
Yeah, yeah,
um, it's interesting how that all ties together.
yeah. Martin Luther has this phrase. He talks about how if we obey if we do the first commandment well, we won't break the other commandments,
Yeah.
especially the first two. Like,
Yeah.
so if I'm not worshiping God, I'm worshiping an idol. If my idol is money, I might kill, steal, and do whatever it takes and neglect justice for the sake of that pursuit.
Right. Right.
And like you just like substitute the sin with the object of worship, that
Right.
vertical.
Right.
Where's your heart
Right.
ultimately?
Right. And that's the core of Deuteronomy is the famous prayer. It's in Deuteronomy 6 in Hebrew. It's called the Shema, which is the first word of the prayer, and it just reads, "Listen, Shema, listen, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." Right, and so that's just the core of Deuteronomy is just unwavering fidelity to God, um, and the way you do that manifests in love for your neighbor. So the book of Deuteronomy is kind of messy in terms of structure. There's a lot to
Yep.
it, and there's a lot of differences. One way to organize the book of Deuteronomy is around the speeches. So Moses gives probably, I think, anywhere from, depending on how you cut it, 2 or 3 speeches throughout the whole book, and then it's sort of flanked by uh, other stories and other. There's like a section of blessings and curses. But there is one way to read Deuteronomy. In the ancient world, ancient Near East, there was this thing called the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. And basically, what it was is when you became like a vassal or like a servant state, like you were protected state by some big empire, you got to have kind of like your own like unique uh, government and ruling, but you had to abide by certain rules. You're sort of like a, what's the word for that in modern terms? I guess it would be like a uh,
Like a colony to an empire. Like,
colony. Yeah, there you go. It's a colony. You're basically a
yeah,
colony,
yeah,
right? And so the empire would draft like a sort of um, like treaty document that would say this is what you can do and this is
yeah,
what you can't do. And so one way to read Deuteronomy, it's actually the structure of these suzerain vassal treaties look a lot like the structure of Deuteronomy. It often begins with a reminder of what the empire did for you and how they, protected you from some sort of foreign invasion. And then it goes through the list of all the things that you need to abide by. And then at the end, it's like, if you don't do these things, this is what will happen. And if you do these things, then you'll be blessed and everything will be okay. So one way to read Deuteronomy is, remove empire, insert God, and everything here is like, this is what God's done for you. This is the sort of instruction that you're called to live by. If you do well in this, it'll go well. If you don't, it won't go well.
yeah, yeah. And like putting God in that position of the ruling party is really where like this word covenant fleshes out.
Right.
Like it's this trust, this agreement, this relationship.
Right.
And that really is the primary theme for me, like not just like in the Pentateuch is God's covenant with his people for the
Right.
blessing of the nations. Like that really for me is so important. So like being obedient is like doing your part and trusting the covenant, like trusting
Mm,
God. Yeah.
yeah. It also, the book sets up, in scholarly circles and maybe sometimes in other, like maybe in some pop Christian writing. I don't know if it shows up there, but you'll hear language of the Deuteronomic history or Deuteronomic writing in the Old Testament. And basically, it's this trajectory that gets sent throughout the rest of the Old Testament where fidelity to the covenant means blessing and infidelity to the covenant means cursing. And so there's a trajectory, especially in some of the historical books, where it'll be like, these guys did the covenant well, and it went really well for them, and they were blessed. These guys didn't do the covenant well, and it went really poorly for them, and they were cursed. It sort of translates Israel's history through the covenant, and if they were faithful to the covenant, it went well. If they weren't, it didn't go well. And so that's a kind of, you'll see that in the literature and in the scholarly research sometimes. Statements that other Old Testament books make will sometimes fit that kind of interpretive grid.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really powerful because it really carries the narrative arc, and it's really important too because like it also understands like how Jesus fulfills the covenant too. If you keep going forward, at least the Christian understanding of the Hebrew scriptures is Jesus fulfills that covenant perfectly and establishes it in a new way by saying like, all right, I'm gonna love God and love others as I love you. This is what it looks like.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's striking that Jesus, when there's that famous story in at least 3 of the Gospels where they ask him, "Hey, what's the most important commandment?" And he quotes Deuteronomy. He quotes the Shema, right?
Yeah.
He also quotes Leviticus, "Would love your neighbor as yourself," but he quotes Deuteronomy as a sort of, that's funny. He restates the restatement.
Yeah.
of the law. So it's kind of interesting how that plays out in the New Testament. I think there's some pretty major themes that we've already been touching on. One of which is, just 100% the theme of covenant fidelity all the way throughout. What other themes are there in Deuteronomy that come up for you?
Well, I mean, I think there's this like importance of just worshiping God. I mean, we touched upon that, but like this heart issue of like the letter, like Moses' final speech is like, you're gonna disobey this and you're gonna suffer consequences. It's like like there's something deeply rooted in humanity that's broken that prevents us from doing this good. So there's that sort of theme of like, this is the standard, it's really high, but since you guys are humans, you're gonna neglect this.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? I was just thinking that too, that in a different light, there's the theme that it seems like words really matter in Deuteronomy. Like these 3 speeches indicate that Moses really puts effort into giving this exhortation or this sermon to the people as a reminder. So there's something about the speech of Moses that is important, like theologically, and just important to the faith. But it's interesting that even the recognition that unfaithfulness or brokenness will still occur, even the recognition that things will still go wrong, doesn't undo the importance of Moses saying these things. Right. So I think that's like helpful for the preacher in general, and just for Christians, I think, in any context, like, just because there won't be results doesn't mean the speech is insignificant. The words are insignificant. The exhortation is meaningless.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of your favorite parts of Deuteronomy?
Yeah, it's hard to find a favorite part. I mean, it's kind of like a restating of all the laws. There's some interesting, fun parts. There's one part in the early on. I believe it's in the introduction to the first speech of Moses, somewhere in chapter 4. But there's a moment where Moses begins the speech and starts to go into the covenant promises, and he starts to call witnesses. And one of the witnesses he calls is the heavens, or are the heavens. And he's calling creation to witness the event that's taking place. So it's like, even if you guys don't remember what I said, the trees here are going to remember that here I'm laying out this covenant to you, and you heard it and you received it, and you've been given the instruction that is important to you. So yeah, I think that's just something kind of fun and powerful in the text rhetorically. What about you?
I kind of like the warnings about false prophets. It's like the litmus test is there. If like if the sign or wonder or the prophetic dream or sign that this person does, and it's just pointing you away from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob,
Yeah.
ignore him.
Yeah.
Like put it to death. Like
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so there's
Yeah.
this radicalness of making sure that there's like some sort of standards of spirituality here.
Mm,
What is it ultimately pointing to?
mm,
So I like that framework of uh of that, because like people could cherry pick the Bible. I'm sure they were cherry picking the law back then.
mm.
People could hyper spiritualize. I'm
Yeah.
sure there was hyper spiritualizing back then. People had these
Yeah.
experiences, but ultimately, is it bearing fruit, and then what is it pointing to?
Mm,
So like I do like this radical nature of like idolatry being the chief evil. Like, don't, just stay away from it. Like,
mm, mm-hmm.
um so I mean, and that theme carries throughout. Just like idolatry, bad. Worship God, don't worship anything else.
Yeah. 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 That's a sustained, a sustained message in the book. Idolatry leads to unhealthy patterns of being in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it makes sense. Like if we're disconnected to the source of life,
Right.
uh the natural consequences is decay. Like, so it's like upholding everything to make sure that the relationship is healthy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's important for us spiritually. Like, are we doing everything in our power to uphold that vertical relationship with God?
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
so, it should lead to this um outward acts of love.
Mm.
It was really funny. I was talking to someone who's at a Christian school, and they were like, he's from overseas, and it was like pretty much telling me how his Christian school was like, there's a lot of people at my school. They're very good with their relationship with God. They make sure everyone knows that they have this relationship with God. And I'm like, so what's off with that? Is like, I don't see that they love or care about the people that they're around. Like, something is fishy here with their relationship with God.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I love like that overseas mindset looking into American Christianity. It was just really
Right.
fascinating.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Like the litmus test for love for God is love for neighbor. And that's like a very like New Testament intuition. Like
yeah, First John is all about that.
John's writing, yeah, John's writing is all about that. You say you love God but hate your neighbor or hate your brother, like that just doesn't fly.
No.
You're a liar.
Yeah.
It just
Stop.
doesn't.
You're
Yeah,
lying.
stop
Stop
being a
it.
liar. Yeah. So it's pretty, yeah, it's rooted in the Old Testament Deuteronomic, conception of what it means to follow God and be faithful to the covenant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some things in this that are a little confusing, or it's difficult to understand in Deuteronomy for you?
Ooh, yeah. One of the things that I've consistently grappled with in Deuteronomy and really through the course it sets for the Old Testament is the formulaic way in which uh, it kind of conceptualizes good things happening to people who do good things and bad things happening to people who do bad things.
Yeah.
Right? That's just not true. I mean, throughout the Old Testament, really terrible things happen to good people and really bad things happen to good people. And so it's not that simple and formulaic. The Deuteronomy cuts it that way for a specific purpose and a specific audience. But you read a book like Job, and
Yeah.
there's even thought that like
Job is older than all these books. Yeah.
yeah, that Job is older. There's stuff in the Psalms that seem to contradict this idea that like just your fidelity. I mean, in some of the Psalms, it's like fidelity to the covenant actually invites suffering and condemnation and what feels like cursing. So um,
Yeah, I think I want, like, I'm just trying to reframe it from the Christian lens, right? Like, Jesus is the prime example of bad
that's
things
right.
happening to a good person, but he's the example of someone doing it faithfully, perfectly, from our perspective. And in this world, it doesn't come to fruition, but in the life to come, it does. So there is some sense of holding that tension.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a great point, because the number one complaint a lot of people have towards Christianity or God is, why do good things happen? Why do bad things happen to good people?
Right. Well, and this and the opposite. Why do good things happen to
Yeah,
bad people? Yeah, and that's I mean that's an angry refrain in the Psalms.
yeah,
Like I'm doing this thing here with the covenant, and these people are making lots of money, and
yeah,
they're
yeah, yeah.
and they're killing us. Like, so how come, where's Deuteronomy now? Like,
Yeah.
so I do think, and also I agree with what you're saying. I just there is a little bit of pushback that y- you know in Deuteronomy, it seems to imagine in the present things will
Yeah,
go well,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And that just doesn't always seem to happen in the Old Testament narrative. But there is also a sort of way of laying out the history of Israel on a macro scale that says, yeah, we didn't listen to this. We didn't follow God, and it led us into exile. And so, on that kind of more macro scale, it does seem to fit that narrative.
Yeah. And
Which
and I and I like that because I think I mean I like the fact that like the Old Testament doesn't blame God. It always blames the people. And I think some self-entitlement American mindset like
yeah,
needs to know your role. Like at the end of the day, like don't be if you know who God is, like
yeah, yeah,
stop your whining. Like own
yeah,
up to your shortcomings at least.
yeah,
I think there's something beautiful in that. Even
yeah,
and God knows the whole data and the details, but like
yeah.
there's something about our mindset where it's like instead of owning it up, most people want to play spin it lane.
Yeah. And I can't wait till we get into this crash course thing and until we get to Job, because I think Job is the real conundrum in this whole thing where
Yeah,
it's like,
and Ecclesiastes and
yeah, well, even I mean, in Job, you don't even, and in Ecclesiastes, but in Job especially, like you don't get an answer. Like you just get this like you get this like theophany, this presentation of God that just ends up somehow resolving the whole thing. But anyway, that's for Job. We'll get
yeah.
there later. Is it what strikes you as kind of uncomfortable or difficult to grasp?
I mean, I would say this is probably one of the harder books for me personally. I think the next one would be Judges, which is coming up soon. But like, uh, I mean, always found it fascinating because like your typical person would say like Moses wrote all five of these. Not your typical person, but there's people who say Moses wrote all these five books. Now they're called the five books of Moses, but like I remember as a high school student learning that Moses wrote Deuteronomy, and I'm like, how is that possible? He narrates his death. So like I like the nuance of the Pentateuch, and I think people have to realize that more than one person wrote this. And even like Paul's letters, he's always writing with someone. The Gospels, you have these gospel writers interviewing people. It's like a collection of people where I believe the Holy Spirit's using them to create something. And even as someone who's like wrote a dissertation in the publication world, so many people have ghostwriters, so many people have hyper edited content.
Yeah,
Like in today's modern thing, it's not like this person just wrote this book. There was like a whole team, and there was like sometimes
yeah,
more than one ghostwriter behind it too. So it's like this notion of like one person writing one thing
right. Well,
is
it's
not
this.
there like now and historically.
Yeah, it's this assumption that for it to be divinely inspired, it has to have an individual being receiving the text like almost, you know, directly from God in that moment. But it just that assumption doesn't it's just that it's an assumption, and it doesn't need to be in place. There's other ways to imagine that inspiration taking course.
Yeah, and I
But
think when more than one person has that inspiration, it validates it.
right,
Like
right,
it's it that
right.
yeah,
Well, and when you look at the Pentateuch, there's been all sorts of, if you're interested in the stuff, you can go look for it. But there's been all sorts of ink spilled about how the Pentateuch came together in its final form, and same with the Gospels. Every book of the Bible has this about it. It's called source criticism. Um, it's not something that's terribly in fashion anymore. It used to be a bigger deal in like the you know 40s and the 50s and the 60s and all that, um there is this sort of general concept that there are traditions and oral stories that were kept by people that sort of collated into these formal books that tell a singular story. And we have those stories, we have those books here, and this kind of punctuates the first five books as the conclusion of this first part of the story, the generative story for the whole
yeah.
rest of the Bible. So it's this last kind of crescendo of this is it. This is faithfulness to God and faithfulness to one another. Boom, now go out.
Yeah.
Go out and be this people. And then, we'll see in Joshua and Judges how that kind of falls apart very quickly and doesn't go as well. But yeah, the general kind of notion that um this concludes the editor's vision of the first part of the story, or the first act of the story is there.
Yeah, and it's crucial. I mean, it's a foundational piece. It's
Yeah.
again, stressing the covenant, stressing that main theme. And I guess the big idea here too. It's not just like a belief in an inactive God, but an active God. God is what God are we worshiping? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a personal God. What does this God do? He does by doing. He freed you from captivity. I think it's always important to know the living person of God, because like
Right.
we stress that it's all about a personal relationship with God. I remember an atheist friend being like, "Where's the personal relationship in the Bible? It never says there's a personal relationship with God." I'm like, I mean, it's here. It's throughout. Like God is a personal God, covenant God. You making a covenant is a relationship. It's a biblical.
Right.
It's a fancy word for
Right.
relationship, promise, commitment.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
I think that's so important, because if we just view the Bible as people who got zapped with prophetic revelation versus a God who continues to be there, like it strips us from being legalistic, dogmatic in a negative sense. But it's all about the scriptures help pointing us to the living God.
Right.
These
Right.
rules pointing us to the living God. Uh, these systems to preserve that relationship with God. All that stuff in Leviticus, it's all to preserve that
Right. Right.
relationship. It's
I think, as you're saying this, it also strikes a chord for me that I don't think we've mentioned yet, but it's 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 profoundly important that we recognize that none of the Leviticus stuff, Numbers stuff, or Deuteronomy stuff happens before the Exodus stuff. Like, God initiates the relationship on the terms of the fact that he loves this people and he wants to bless creation, right?
yeah,
So he does that stuff in an act purely of his own freedom and desire to be with creation and be with us.
yeah,
All of the other stuff maintains and preserves that relationship in a way that
yeah,
allows life to flow in and through us as a community and as individuals. So we haven't said that yet, but I do want to emphasize that before we close. Like, all of this faithfulness to the covenant and all that assumes that Exodus took place and that the event of God choosing to be with creation took
yeah.
place, right?
And that same logic carries through to Christianity. Jesus said, like, all right, wait till I do my job to save you from sin and death.
Mm-hmm.
Um, wait for the Holy Spirit so I could be with you now.
Mm-hmm.
So after the gospel is completed, after the Holy Spirit descends on Pentecost, then go
Right,
tell the nations,
right, right.
because I've done this for you.
Right. And in John, love because I first loved you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I manifest love. I show you love. I've given you what, you need to do. Now that I've shown you and manifested that love, now you go do it for one another.
Yeah, and it's an important detail, like with the new covenant I give you. When Jesus says this, go love others, I have loved you. He
Yeah.
says it like right after Judas is about to betray him. So the things are
Right.
set in motion.
Right.
Now he's saying, no greater love is this, to give your life for a friend.
Right. 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 So it's an important note or marker that the priority of God's redemptive movement towards us just it precedes everything else that takes place in the rest of the story. I mean, God acting always issues in other things taking place,
Yep.
right? And so, um, you know, the very beginning of the Bible starts with God's act of creation, and the story generates out of that decision to create and make life in order. So, and that continues not throughout the Old Testament, but even throughout the New Testament. So,
Absolutely, man. Good stuff as
yeah,
always. If no one else is listening, we are learning from this.
yeah, we
But for
are.
those who are listening, we thank you for making it to the end of this program. Don't just take our word for it, but read the good word yourself. Read Deuteronomy. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We'd love to put our scholarship and biblical studies and all the hours we placed in to learning the Bible and share any questions you may have. If you want any comments, put it in the posts. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple Podcasts. You can't really put comments there, but you could put comments on YouTube and Facebook. So thank you for listening. Stay caffeinated, and we'll keep crash coursing through the Bible until we get through all the books. So thank
66.
you. That's right. All right, brother. Thank you, and God bless everyone.
Bye, everyone.